In January of 1969, Herschel Greer, vice president of Vols Incorporated, the stock corporation that owned the now defunct Nashville Vols and the property known as Sulphur Dell, announced the ownership group approved a sale to Frederic Gregg Jr., and he was an owner of Lin Broadcasting Group, that's Lin. According to Greer, Gregg paid $255,000 for the land. His intent was not to keep it as a ballpark. Instead, he said a merchandise mart would be built on the 4-acre site as soon as architects had completed the plans. Vols Incorporated, the ownership group, had been trying to sell the land for 5 years. At the time baseball left the ballpark in 1963, it was the oldest park in use in the United States. Until 1969, when the sale was announced, the land had been a racetrack, a site for one-night rock and roll shows, the circus, a tow-in lot for the city of Nashville, and most recently, a parking lot for a company called Oak Motors. Oak Motors paid $300 a month to use the park to store automobiles. Now, there had been several offers for the ballpark, between $150,000 to $200,000, turned down for one reason, because those would not allow repayment in full to Vols Incorporated stockholders. But the $255,000 figure that Gregg would pay would be just enough to be sure that all $5 shares of Vols Incorporated stock would be reimbursed. The sale included nothing, no commission to an agent. Now, what was Gregg going to do with the property? Well, his intention was to erect a building 15 to 20 stories high to contain around 150,000 square feet of floor space, claiming it would be the regional center to bring wholesale merchandise buyers and sellers together. This merchandise mart will serve as a focal point for wholesale trade and will further equip Nashville to take full advantage of its geographical location and existing leadership, Gregg was quoted as saying in a January the 5th, 1969 Nashville Tennessean article. But 1 week later, the Saturday Evening Post Company took over the reins of Lin Broadcasting by buying Gregg out. Now, what of this Lin Broadcasting Company? Well, it was founded in Nashville in 1961 as a radio broadcasting company and built up a relatively small communications conglomerate dominated by Broadcast Radio Holdings. Under the leadership of Frederic Gregg Jr., the company purchased WTVP-TV of Decatur, Illinois, from Metro Media for $2 million in 1965. It bought controlling interest in Medallion Pictures, 375 feature films and cartoons, and expanded its radio holdings with the purchase of 3 Houston, Texas stations, KILT-AM and FM, and KOST-FM for $15 million in 1967. And Lin Broadcasting also purchased sister radio and TV stations WAVY and WAVY-TV of Norfolk and Portsmouth, Virginia that year. And in 1968, the company acquired the Adonis Radio Corporation, an advertising media buyer, to complete its broadcast holdings. And I want to say back in the day that Lin Broadcasting owned either WKDA, I'm not really sure, or WMAK, but I'm not positive about that. But Lin Broadcasting also bought into several peripheral businesses during the 1960s, including a chain of national art galleries, a telephone answering and radio paging service, several direct marketing companies, an educational concern, and the Miss Teenage America pageant. These wide-ranging operations contributed to over $1 million in combined losses in 1967 and 1968, which culminated in dramatic administrative changes at Lin. And guess what? The company's leadership crisis began in January 1969 when Martin S. Ackerman's Saturday Evening Post company purchased Frederic Gregg Jr.'s 4% interest in Lin. And Lin's infamy definitely shortened his tenure at Lin. After 5 weeks as president and CEO, Ackerman was fired by the broadcast company's board of directors. It seemed like although they had bought a lot of companies and produced a lot of income, there was something going on there. And by the way, the Saturday Evening Post suspended publication that year. They were $67 million in debt. But on April the 4th, the Tennessean reported in its business section that Gregg delivered a check for $245,000, completing the purchase of old Sulphur Dell to make way for his $5 million merchandise mart. All that remained was for Herschel Greer to approve the liquidation of the corporation to pay each stockholder 100 cents on the dollar they invested in the baseball operation. Now, Gregg's attorney, Frank Wood, said a contract had been awarded to Burke Wrecking Company to demolish the Sulphur Dell grandstands, possibly as soon, he said, as next week. Meanwhile, Gregg had also purchased property in the downtown area and announced plans to build an office building and other properties. And he hoped to have the building ready, the new merchandise mart ready, to open at Sulphur Dell by the end of 1971. But just a couple of weeks after he gave the check for $245,000 to Herschel Greer, on Wednesday, April the 17th, about 35 people gathered to say goodbye to Sulphur Dell. As a little after 2 p.m., a giant claw was raised at the roof of the grandstand near right field, and it took a big bite out of that grandstand portion. Former pro baseball players Johnny Beasley, Eddie Lewis, and Clyde L. Castleman were there. So was 75-year-old Willie White, who spent 32 years with Nashville's teams beginning in 1923 and ending in 1955. He was the equipment manager, the masseuse, the medic, and he held the keys to Sulphur Dell to let neighborhood boys into the ballpark to play games when the Vols were out of town. He even let them use some of the team's bats and balls and gloves. Now, Whitey Larkin was there. He ran the baseball office at the park. And Clifford Allen, Metro tax assessor, of course Herschel Greer, and even Mrs. Jim Turner came. Her husband, Jim Turner, was the manager of the Nashville Vols in 1960 and was off in New York as the pitching coach for the New York Yankees. She was quoted as saying, "I realized when I saw that piece in the paper this morning that I didn't even have a picture of the Dell. She brought her movie camera." And George Flanagan, who was once a Vols bat boy, was there. And Johnny Beasley swung a bat and hit the last ball ever to be hit in the Dell. It was a sad occasion for all of them, as the Dell would be no more. Well, as often happened with construction plans that need long-term financing, the Merchandise Mart project collapsed. It was what Albert Kaysen of the Tennessean called, in the business section of the newspaper, an unprecedented shortage of mortgage funds. And it was determined that the 4.2 acres of land that comprised the Sulphur Dell property be sold in 22 lots. And those were purchased on September the 9th, 1971, by 4 Nashville businessmen for $286,191. The buyers were John Ozer, Maxwell Horkins, and Ira E. Parker III, both of them from Grimes and Horkins Realtors. And 2 lots were purchased by United Service, headed by Edward Voorhees, for $22,625. All lots were sold by the frontage foot, with the lowest going for $250 per foot and the highest at $300 per foot, and it was imagined the area would be named Sulphur Dell Center with new construction. And Frederic Gregg Jr., well, he may have broken even. So the tract of land we remember as Sulphur Dell sat silent for many more years, but there's a happy ending. With the announced sale of the ballpark, memories came from Nashville baseball fans, and one was especially touching, at least to me. It was published in the Tuesday, January 21st, 1969 edition of the Tennessean. In the letters to the editor section, it was from Mrs. G.B. Batson, who said her address was at 711 Shelby Avenue, and her story reads like this. With the sale of Sulphur Dell, another Nashville landmark will fade away. Yes, even a national landmark, for on this little plot of ground, baseball has been played longer than at any other place in the United States, and its size and the famous right field dump had been grist for the mill of a great many sports writers over the country. Sulphur Dell, as such, will be gone completely, but the erection of a multi-million-dollar building on the site cannot take away the memories, some pleasant, some depressing. Many of us have of the years when our Nashville Vols took the field there. To borrow the words of a current song hit, those were the days, my friend. I think a bit of thanks should go to those men serving as officers and directors of Vols Incorporated, she continues, for their patient and untiring efforts to bring about a deal that would give the stockholders a complete return on their investment. Their task has not been an easy one, and even though I will be glad to have my very small amount back, I would gladly reinvest it for the return of Larry Gilbert type of baseball in old Sulphur Dell. But since the demise of the ballpark was inevitable, I'm glad that the space is to be used for something of dignity, of value to the community. Perhaps after this new enterprise is completed, I can pass by without turning my head to keep from seeing the pitiful shell of an old friend. Well, I'm not sure if Mrs. Batson is still alive, but something of dignity, value to the community did happen to the space. Baseball returned in the form of a new ballpark for the Nashville Sound's First Horizon Park. So, Mrs. Batson, fast forwarding 45 years, we all know the Nashville Sound's playing a beautiful stadium that overlaps the lake location of old Sulphur Dell, and I think you'd be very, very proud of it.